So hi, everyone. I think everybody knows me. I'm Christian Jerry. I'm the program chair. And tonight we have Ray Harris coming to speak to us. And Ray is a local guy. He's from the Allentown area. He's a nuclear engineer, originally with the Navy, and then subsequently in private industry at PPL up in Allentown. And from about the mid 1980s or so, Ray got very interested in astronomy. He's an avid astrophotographer. A lot of his work has actually been published. And he's a member of the Lehigh Valley Astronomical Society. I believe he was president at one point, at least that's what my intel told me. But in the late 1980s, there was sort of a turning point. He purchased a pair of celestial charts and atlases from the 1740s. And this kind of started him on this journey that's now been, I guess, 35 or so years, where he, is intensely studying these types of, older documents and charts, sort of trying to understand, origins, the historical backdrop, if you will, around a lot of the known and now lost constellations. And so this is his passion, and he's going to give us a talk today, sort of a celestial journey, if you will, take us through some of the known and more importantly, some of the lost constellations. So, Ray, thank you for coming.
Greetings. So we know our night sky and we know our 88 constellations. We can't see them all from here because some of them are too far south, but many of us have wondered, where did they come from? And the origins of our constellations make an interesting story. But one of the questions we have to ask is, why 88? And the answer to that is there were a lot more than 88 created over the years. But the International Astronomical Union in 1930 said, we got to stop the madness here, because we label variable stars based on what constellation they're in. So we have to know what the definitive list of constellations is and the boundaries of those constellations. And formal boundaries for constellations had never been set. So the IAU published a list of 88 constellations, and they did this by reaching back into what had been developed over the many years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the 88 and how we got them, but also some that didn't make the cut in 1930 and got lost along the way. Many of these lasted for decades or centuries. In one case, multiple millennia, and then got cut in 1930. So we're going to go through and understand that. So we start with the 48, and your Zoom is covering up the top two, Andromeda and Cassiopeia. But there were 48 produced in a document called the Almagest by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century. He didn't invent these 48 constellations. We know that he had earlier sources, but those are lost to us. The actual origins of some of the zodiac go back another couple of thousand years beyond Ptolemy. And the Greeks had a role in a few hundred years before the birth of Christ to come up with a number of things that are in Greek mythology. So we start with a list of 48. 47 of those came down to us. Why not 48? Argo Navis was a huge area in the southern sky. And when the IAU came time to decide what to include, they thought it was too big and they needed to break it up. And we'll learn a little bit about how that happened and when that happened. But in essence, Argo Navis was a popular constellation right up until the IAU cut it. So it lasted multiple thousands of years. Here we see Argo Navis as it appeared in the first great celestial atlas, the first one that was done with copper plates instead of woodcuts, 1603 by Johann Bayer. And you'll note 1603 is before the telescope. So up until Bayer's atlas, most of the charts had been based on Ptolemy's record of the stars. Ptolemy didn't have charts; he just had lists with coordinates. But Johann Bayer relied on those observations of Tycho Brahe. His were a lot better, better gradations of stars, more stars. And so his atlas was monumentally important in the 1600s. The first star charts that were produced were by a guy named Albrecht Dürer. He's a famous artist, and he happened to make the first star charts in 1515. And 1515, the Almagest was the ultimate authority on astronomy. And so his constellations are exactly the 48 that were in Ptolemy's Almagest from the 2nd century. First thing you'll notice, though, is there are some significant gaps in the sky where not much is going on constellation-wise. And when cartographers began to make charts and globes, they didn't like big empty areas. They needed to fill them in. And so that's what started this creation of new constellations. The first new one that was created was by Caspar Vogel in 1536, created a globe, and he added 2 constellations. The first one, Coma Berenices, actually was described by Ptolemy as a milky area, but he didn't consider it a separate constellation. Caspar Vogel made it a separate constellation, and so it's our first new constellation, even though its origins go back all the way to Ptolemy. Coma Berenices was shown in Bayer's, but not as a separate constellation. It really just was you could call it a footnote. Major. So we can see Coma Berenices in the lower corner. But interestingly, he wasn't very consistent, because on the chart of Boötes, here you can see the tail of the bear, and you can see Coma Berenices now shown as a sheaf of wheat. So he wasn't even on atlas. But Coma Berenices proceeded to be shown on nearly everything following this atlas. And here we show it. The only time it ever appeared as its own constellation chart was in an atlas published, a really kind of odd atlas, in 1730. And we're going to hear more about the Thomas Atlas of 1730, because a lot of obsolete constellations made their last appearance. That was kind of their last hurrah. The second one that Caspar Vogel introduced in 1536 was Antinous. Antinous was also described by Ptolemy as part of Aquila, the eagle, and often in the claws of Aquila. And Antinous is a historical character, and here we see him in the Bayer Atlas. And Antinous was popular and showed up in nearly everything after 1536. Showed up as not as a separate constellation, but clearly labeled, and you would think it a separate constellation. And it carried in again right to about 1900, and then the IEU decided it didn't make the cut. So this one is our second obsolete constellation. But if you look at any of the historical planispheres or atlases from the 16, 17, 1800s, you'll find Antinous. And again, this is the 1730 atlas by Thomas, that strange one I told you about. And it's the only time Antinous got star billing, where he appeared by himself. The next added constellations were by a guy named Petrus Plancius. I don't know if anybody here gets Sky and Telescope. I had an article this past February on the constellations of Petrus Plancius, so you're going to get a review of that article today. In 1589, he put out a globe and he wanted to fill in some of the area in the south that was empty. And so he put a big triangle and a big cross. These have no bearing on our current crux or Triangulum Australe. This is Triangulum Antarcticus. And he just put them there because there'd been reports of these shapes with the stars from some of the explorers, but he didn't have any idea where they were. And so he just put some in down there for interest. He later basically trained a couple of Dutch navigators because he was in Amsterdam. He trained a couple of Dutch navigators to chart the southern skies because they didn't have good charts of the southern skies. And those navigators brought back to him 120 good star positions. And so he later created a bunch of new constellations we'll see shortly that were more accurate star positions, and these got abandoned. So these are also two that are obsolete. Not to be outdone, 3 years later, he added two more in the southern sky. He added Columba, the dove, and Polophylax, the guardian of the South Pole. Columba we still have. Polophylax, not so much. He died out pretty quickly because, again, when Plancius got good charts of the southern skies, he redid the southern sky. And so these three, the cross, the triangle, and Polophylax, got wiped out by the creator himself. He replaced them with later constellations. We can see those a little closer here. So here's Columba and the wrong crux, which we know over here, and Triangulum, which is over here, and then Polophylax. So in 1598, Plancius took the information he got from those Dutch navigators that he trained, and he recreated the southern sky and introduced 12 new constellations, and he moved crux to a position that was kind of described by Ptolemy. So he recreated another one, a different crux, in the feet of Centaurus. One of these you'll say Apus. We have Apus and Apus, and later we're going to see Apes, all created by Plancius. Apus pretty quickly morphed into Musca. You'll see Apus or Musca Apus showing up on charts into the 1700s, but Musca predominated after about 1660. And so today it's Musca. And the difference is Apus is a bee and Musca is a fly. But we're going to give Petrus Plancius a credit for this because they don't appear much different on the charts and they're the same stars. It's not really a recreation of the constellation. And these 12, which he introduced, showed up in Bayer's Atlas. Here you see Apus right here, along with Nabecular Major and Nabecular Minor, so the Magellanic Clouds. So these 12 got their own chart based on the Dutch navigators' positions of stars and Petrus Plancius's contributions. And here's where he put Crux, at the time shown actually within the feet of Centaurus. Later charts would show Centaurus's feet kind of moved away so that they didn't overlap. Plancius wasn't done, however. He took a break, but in 1612, he introduced 8 more constellations on a globe, and those began to get picked up on charts and were very popular, some of them right up until the 1730s. And so they lasted more than 100 years and would have been known to astronomers back in the 1600s. Only 2 of those have survived, Melopardus and Monoceros. The others, notice we had Apus, Apis, and now we got Apes, which is the northern bee. So in this chart from 1660, It used a lot of these, and here we see the Jordan River, the Tigris River. We're going to look at each of these individually. In the south, we've got Monoceros and Gallus the rooster down here by his feet. So as we look through these, so the Jordan River initiated in the mountains Jor and Dan and ran around Ursa Major. The Tigris River wound its way through the northern sky below Cygnus and above Aquila. Apis showed up here in 4 stars that were prominent in above the constellation Aries and were considered part of Aries by Ptolemy. Apis had an interesting history because it kept morphing into different things, as we'll see. Cancer Minor showed up, and you'll notice Cancer often shows up as a lobster on the old charts instead of a crab. But we had Cancer Minor from Petrus Plancius. And we had Sagitta Austral. So we have a second Sagitta down here between Sagittarius and Scorpio. And below Monoceros, we had Gallus the rooster. None of those survived. Some of them died very quickly, but the rivers lasted for a long time. We're going to talk about a little bit more about some of that, but first we're going to talk about Julius Schiller's Atlas 1627. I've ignored people who created a constellation that nobody else embraced. If nobody else embraced it, it wasn't worth really talking about, because you and I can invent a constellation that historically it has no meaning. Julius Schiller put out what is arguably the best artistic atlas of its time, I think maybe ever. Look at the artwork in this one. It's spectacular. He actually used telescopic observations, because this is a few years after the telescope was invented. And in fact, his area of the Pleiades shows more stars than anything prior to this. Is 1627. The next chart that showed more stars in Pleiades was in 1782. So he was showing 10 stars in the Pleiades because of telescopic observations. The one thing he did, though, that made his atlas kind of a footnote rather than something important, is that he replaced all the constellations. He Christianized the sky. No more pagan constellations. So the zodiac became the 12 apostles. The northern sky were New Testament figures, and the southern sky were Old Testament figures. Anyone figure out what this one is? I'll tell you, it's reversed. Can anyone figure out what it is? We got the Pleiades here and the Hyades here. This is Taurus, not St. Andrew. And it was just too radical a change. No one was willing to embrace it. I say no one embraced it, but there was an atlas put out in 1660. It's a spectacularly colorful atlas, originally colored. It's highly popular. There's a copy for sale right now from a map dealer in La Jolla, California, if you've got $375,000. These charts are too expensive for anything in my collection. I don't know. Individual charts will run you $6,000. He did include multiple views of things. He looked at Tycho Brahe's view of. He looked at Ptolemy's view of the solar system with the Earth in the center, Copernicus's view with the sun in the center, and Tycho Brahe's view with the Earth in the center, but Venus and Mercury circling the sun. So he gave equal time to everybody, and he gave equal time to the Schiller's constellations, but this is the only other time they appear. Now, following in 1612 when Petrus Plancius introduced the last of his 25 constellations. And think about that. He introduced 25 constellations and 16 of them still grace our skies. That's a pretty good total. After that, it was pretty much one here, one there. So in 1621, Hebrecht put out a constellation called Rhombus. I love this one. I like it a lot. You'll see it in a minute. Jacob Barsch created Vespa. Stanislaw Lubinecki, I'm going to give him a question mark there for creating Musca. Usually Musca is credited to Hevelius, but we'll in 1687, but we're going to look at this. Francis Lamb, Cor Caroli, Pardis put out Lilium, Edmund Halley put out Robert. So we're going to go through these. Royer put out Septrum, and Gottfried Kirsch put out Brandenburg Scepter. Any of these look familiar? They're all obsolete. None of them survived. But a lot of them survived for quite a long time. You can see 1621 to 1730. Vespa pretty much just in 1624. Musca all the way to 1900. Carcaroli, 1900. Lilium last appeared in 1789. Robert Carolinum carried a lot of these carried through right to 1900, and then the IEU killed them. So here's Rhombus as it appears on a chart published in 1691 by Corneli. Corneli's famous because he created a celestial globe for the King of France, a unique one that's lost to us, that was 24 feet in diameter. He also produced ones commercially for sale that were 42.5 inches in diameter. And he was smart because what he did is he sold it gore by gore as a subscription. And once you got all the gores, you took it to your local map maker. You didn't have to ship a globe across Europe. Is there a question? In some cases, they just wanted to fill something in. In other cases, they were honoring somebody. And in this case, it was King Charles II. So we'll get to that. But anyway, Rhombus, I like this constellation. We can't see it from up here because it's right down around the South Pole. But I just think it's got a nice shape and it appears nicely. Vespa the Wasp. This is the exact spot that Plancius put Apis the bee. So here we have the same 4 stars being used for different things. Bee, wasp, fly, who knows? Cor Caroli actually showed up before Canis Venatici. Yeah, whatever. It showed up here, and it's really just a single star, but it's honoring King Charles. So an astronomer would do that so that patron. Lubinecki is not a well-known chart maker because he never really put out an atlas. What he did is he plotted paths of comets across the sky. And so every comet he could find any details about, any historical records of, he plotted it across the sky, and he just showed the constellations that others used. Most of his charts that show Aries have a bee up here called Apis, which is what Plancius said. But on one chart, he labeled it Vespa, the wasp. And on this chart, it's the only one I know of that he labeled it Musca, the fly. So I got to give him credit for being the first guy that ever called that Musca, but I don't think it really influenced things. I think you'll see later Hevelius's atlas. Now, did Hevelius get this from Lubinecki? I can't imagine why, because most of his charts he called it Apis, not Musca. But that's just a historical little aside. Then Parties came along and he didn't like any of those things. And since he was French, he gave it a French fleur de lis. Same spot, just different constellation. And it's called Giglio here because this is an Italian chart from 1691 by Cornelli, but the French called it Lilium. Here we have Robert Caroli, and this constellation lasted right into the 1900s. This was Edmund Halley's contribution. This is the oak tree that King Charles II hid in after the Battle of Worcester that he lost to Cromwell. So it's a pretty important tree historically from English English history, but clearly honoring King Charles. But it stuck. Just because it was honoring King Charles doesn't mean it didn't find favor with lots of other cartographers, including cartographers who weren't British. Notice here we see Crux, and the feet of Centaurus have now moved away a little bit. And we have Musca Apis for the southern constellation. Musca is a fly, Apis is a bee. You tell me, I don't know. This was one that I like a lot. It didn't last very long. It was created by August Royer in 1679 and showed up on a few charts, including, again, this Italian one by Cornelli in 1691. We have Lacerta in this area now. Others tried to stick things in even with Lacerta, but this one was taking up that area at the time, the septum. The next one's very weird. Gottfried Kirch introduced Brandenburg's scepter in 1688. Nobody paid any attention to it. It was promptly lost to history until Johann Bode put out an atlas in 1782, 94 years later, and he resurrected it. And once Bode put it in, everybody did. So Bode's atlases were highly influential, and 100 years after it was created, it suddenly got picked up and carried on all the way to 1900. But it did have almost a 100-year gap where nobody paid any attention to it. The next great atlas after Bayer's of 1603 was Johann Hevelius's. We say 1687 because that's the date in the actual atlas, but he died in 1687 and his wife published it posthumously, and it really didn't get published until 1690. He introduced a bunch of new constellations, and I think that you'll notice the highlighted ones, they are still around. So he contributed 7 of our constellations. The ones that didn't make it were Poor Answer, the goose in Vulpecula's jaw, Mons Menelaus, someplace for Bootus to stick his feet, and Triangulum Minus, and now you'll notice he used Musca for that insect above Aries. Hevelius's atlas was the best thing since Bayer, better than Bayer, because he relied on the southern sky constellation, southern sky observations of Edmund Halley to chart the southern sky. And so he has much more detailed charts of the southern sky, but he didn't trust the telescope. All his observations were by the northern stars were his personal observations. Anyway, this one's lost to us, but it lasted right up until the 1900s. And Musca also lasted. Interestingly, at this point, I told you that the Musca in the south, Apis in the south, had morphed into Musca, and the northern one here is Musca. His atlas, Hevelius, both are labeled Musca, and that carried through quite a few charts. I've got multiple atlases from the 1700s that show a Musca in the north and a Musca in the south, and they aren't called Austral and Borealis. They're just both Musca. That would have been confusing, clearly. So IAU had to cut one of them, and they cut the one that is in Aries. In 1730, from Hevelius's atlas in 1690 until 1740, there weren't any new constellations created. It's a 50-year gap, nothing new. In 1730, the atlas by one I told you, where he had a lot of constellations that made their swan song. Between 1690 and 1730, what you saw was kind of equal time between the constellations that had been invented before Hevelius and the ones that Hevelius has replaced. So, for example, the Jordan River didn't survive. Hevelius put Lynx and Leo Minor in the area where this is, and they became the prevalent ones that survived to our modern times. But the Jordan River made its last appearance in 1730. The Tigris River made its last appearance in 1730. Rhombus made its last appearance in 1730. Septrum made its last appearance in 1730. And Lilium made its last appearance in 1730, although it did get published in two obscure planispheres the French put out in the 1780s, but really not important pieces. After that atlas, we began to see a few more things created. So Pierre Charles Lemonnier, 1743, created Ren, the reindeer, up here above Camelopardalis. That was a popular one because Boda adopted it, and Boda's atlas of 1801 influenced everything in the 1800s, and so it pretty much lasted until 1900. In 1755, a guy named Nicholas Louis de Lacaille published 16 new constellations that he crammed in and around the southern constellations that had been produced mostly by Plancius, but also some of the ones that had been produced or reported by Ptolemy. All 14 of those survived. Then 9 years later, he took Argo Navis and broke it up into Carina the keel, Pupus the poop deck, Vela the sails, thank you, and Malus the mast. A few obscure atlases picked these up, these three, Carina, Pupus, and Vela. Nobody picked up Malus, it just died. Some people consider Pixis as part of the breakup of Argo Navis, but basically Pixis survived. These were really not adopted. Argo Navis continued until 1900. Very few people broke it up into these separate pieces. However, in 1930, when the IAU decided that Argo Navis was too big, they reached back 160 years and said, that looks good to us. And so they picked up 3 of the 4 that Lacaille had produced in 1764. So those were pulled out of the antiquity and included in our sky. Here's a chart by a guy named Cassini the Younger from 1790, and you can see how crowded the southern sky got with all of Lacaille's constellations crowded in around those of Petrus Plancius. But Argo Navis is still Argo Navis. Following that, we see a variety, after Lacaille's work, we see a variety of constellations begin to be proposed. And these were all people who were sharing ideas. In some cases, Lalande just liked to invent things and throw them at Boda and say, here's one for you. So there were a lot of things being created. Bode created George's harp, Psalterium Georgianum, in 1768, and because it was Bode and his atlas was so of 1801, so included it in all his atlases. It carried on to 1900. Custos Messium, honoring Charles Messier, 1775, lasted until 1900. The Solitaire by Monnier, till 1900. Poniatowski's Bull, honoring his patron, Martin Hochschild, 1900. Gloria Frederica by Bode, lasted until 1900. William Herschel was looking at reporting thousands of deep sky objects, and he stumbled on a planet, which at the time the world called Herschel. And because of that, he became very famous. That was in 1782. And so Maximilian Hell created two telescopes in the sky, major and minor, by Herschel. One of those lasted until 1900, but for some reason, no atlas included both. It was one or the other, even though they were in different locations. And the minor telescope really only appeared 3 times. It appeared in a French atlas from 1795 and a German atlas in 1799, which was then reissued in 1819. So that's the only time the telescope minor appeared. That's another favorite of mine we're going to talk about a little bit. And then Quadrants Moralis by de Lalande in 1900. Little aside on Quadrants Moralis. None of these still exist. These are all obsolete. But Quadrants Moralis carries down to us. Anyone want to hazard a way? Meteor showers are named after the constellation of their radiant, Quadrantids. The quadrantid meteor showers radiant is in what used to be Quadrants Moralis. So it was named before the constellation was obsoleted, and so we still call it that. So here we have George's harp. This is under Taurus and near Orion. And the resurrected Brandenburg scepter. Here we have Custos Messium keeping that reindeer happy. And the Solitaire was created with this chart in 1776, and it's actually located near the tail of Hydra, just below Libra. Poniatowski's Bull isn't too far from Scutum, which was originally Scutum Silesianum, because it also was honoring Hevelius's patron. Notice Antinous here on the Aquila. Another little interesting aside, the star Altair. I was talking with my son about all this, and he says, Altair, you mean Altair? He said, Altair is, because he speaks Arabic fluently, he was a translator in the army. Altair means eye of the eagle. So the interesting influence on all this stuff. Johann Bode produced this constellation, Frederick's Glory, again honoring a patron. So this is, you see it crammed in here beside Lacerta, pretty much in the same area where Spectrum used to be, interestingly. The large telescope just above Gemini, Herschel's large telescope, and Herschel's small telescope between Orion and Taurus. And the reason I find this one interesting is because I was studying this chart one day and noticed there's a star underlined right here and labeled Herschel. That's what they called Uranus at the time this chart was printed in 1795. So I said, well, they must be, it's right on the ecliptic. You can see that. This must be the planet. Well, if you're going to put a planet on a chart, what year was that plotted for? And I tried to match it up and I found it didn't match 1795 when the atlas was printed. And it didn't match 1782 when Uranus was discovered. But it did look like it fit around 1690. And then doing more reading, I found Flamsteed had observed it and recorded it in 1690, but didn't realize it was a planet. He just recorded it as a star. But Boda, when the reports of the planet came in, was going back looking for research, and he's discovered that it had been observed by Flamsteed, and that allowed him to refine the orbit. And he is famous for that, Boda, for basically refining Uranus's orbit based on the observations Flamsteed made. Flamsteed died in 1709. This is 1795. So they're documenting where it was discovered by Flamsteed. But that's kind of a weird thing to do, to put there, because that's not where the planet is at the time the chart was published. Here's our Quadrans Borealis, right near Draco. And that's where our quadrantid meteors radian is. And then for Boda's Boda put out lots of atlases, but the big one in 1801 was the one where he went from 3,000 stars to 17,000 stars. His charts were humongous. They were really big. And he included all 2,500 deep sky objects that Herschel had discovered and hundreds of double stars. So that atlas was really influential in the 1800s. Well, he introduced 5 more constellations, one from Delon called Felis the Cat, Aeronautical Globe by Delon, and then 3 more that Boda did, Locuum Funis, Machina Electrica, and basically the office type. So we can see these, like here's Felis the Cat. And here's just a second, I forget the name. Yeah, Locum Funis. This is a tool used by ships to determine their speed through the water, and this is the office type. So he's cramming these in around other things. This one shows Locum Funis a little better. So it's a little hard to trace in the sky. And here's his aerial balloon and his electrical machine. Again, cramming things in around the southern sky. None of these 5 survived. Boda's atlas included 109 constellations and influenced many charts produced throughout the 1800s. Following his atlas, there was really only one other attempt to add any new constellations. In 1822, Alexander Jameson put out a small atlas based on Flamsteed's, and he got rid of Solitaire and replaced it with Noctua the Owl. And in the south, he replaced Reticulum with Solarium, the sundial. These were picked up by Elijah Burritt in his atlas of 1835, and that atlas is famous because it's the first American atlas, and it was used in schools for education throughout America. So children being raised and taught about astronomy all learned from Burritt. But that's pretty much it. And after 1835, these were really never brought up again. So where did our 48 constellations really come from? 47 of them come from antiquity to us via Ptolemy's Almagest. One by Caspar Vopel in 1536. Plancius gets credit for 16 over his career. Avelius jumped in with 7 in his atlas, and Lacaille did 14, and then the 3 that replaced Argonavis gave him a total of 17, and that's our 88 constellations. Any questions?
In 1930, rejiggered the whole thing. If you go back to that chart,
Oh, yeah.
then, the developments are highly irregular.
Oops,
And so what was the process?
I've lost it.
So what was the process by which they went about signing that? And there must have been a lot of people.
It was 1922 when they basically settled on the names of the constellations and the 3-letter abbreviations.
Okay.
They needed to have 3-letter abbreviations that were unique. I don't know what process they went through, but it was a committee.
Committee.
And I think it was 1928 when they formalized the boundaries. And then they published it in 1930.
So we get it back.
There's reports you can read. I haven't read them. Yeah, you published all that.
I don't know where it went.
Neither do I.
They even lost their share.
Any other questions? Yes.
Any
All right.
new constellations out of since?
There really couldn't be. So, I mean, anyone, you've seen people talk about asterism.
Yeah, that's right.
Here's the Kohe. Here's this and here's that. But those aren't constellations. Interestingly, in Japanese, Suba means star, and Subaru is the name of the constellation, the Pleiades. If you remember the old emblem for Subaru, it was the Pleiades. Well, that's a constellation in Japan. Or at least it was in their lore. Every culture had its own lore and its own constellations, but Western astronomy pretty much carried the day. Any other questions?
Native American.
Don't know much about them. They did have some. I've got a synthetic chart from 1760 something, where all the Western constellations are overlaid with Chinese constellations. Yeah, somebody, a Jesuit in China, wanted to document them, but he overlaid them on top of the, so they're literally superimposed on top of our constellation. Anybody else? Where you at? All right, thank you.
Zoom went. Zoom's really misbehaving tonight. I can't even get the control screen back.
Killed it, right?
Great.
So if you go in the main entrance, you look to the left, there's a gate. It's open. The top of the hill, make a right. And there's a pavilion. To the right, yeah, yeah. I can't remember last month was anyone there. Yeah, it's up to the right, when that tower to the right, it's a good number. I think I was there last month. I don't think so. Are you a club member? Yeah, you can certainly come anytime there. This Zoom was really misbehaving tonight. I can't shut it down. I have to shut the computer down. It's really weird. We've done this over and over. We never had these problems. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Look, I can't even shut Zoom down. Look at it. I mean, I can't get the control panel back. Now I can.